That is a very general question. We can talk about for hours, but I'll summarize, okay?
Yeah. It's still being debated. It's like CDS is biased.
That is not just for Muslim, but it has been the case for Catholic, Protestant for centuries.
Linguistics and critical discourse studies or other social sciences, how do they represent race?
And actually, I'm now writing a paper together with a colleague in Brasilia, analyzing the history of Portuguese colonial laws.
So in a way, we can say that CDS is not just a lip service.
What can I say?
Thank you very much, Professor Teun Dijk, for your time and opportunity to talk to you on critical discourse studies, academic racism, and textbooks. As one of the founders of critical discourse studies, I begin by asking you a very general question about the motivation and inspiration behind the critical discourse studies project, and if you could also share your academic journey that led you towards this project.
That is a very general question. We can talk about for hours, but I'll summarize, okay?
Yeah.
As you know, most of my work of around the 70s was to begin to study discourse and not language in general.
Yeah.
So, of course, I've been educated also in structural linguistics, generative linguistics, and so on. It was all limited to sentences and grammar and so on.
Yeah.
And, of course, very soon, when I was starting to do my dissertation on text grammars, I was interested in linguistics of discourse. So in the beginning, it was mostly linguistic discourse analysis, things like coherence and that kind of thing, topics. So this is typically there in my dissertation of 72, and then books of the 70s on like text and context and so on.
Yeah.
But especially after visiting a country in global south, Mexico, I was observing many forms of poverty and many forms of racism against indigenous people.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, how can this kind of discourse analysis be relevant not just for linguistics, but also for the world and for real problems of the world?
Yeah.
So I already had broadened my more linguistic interest to psychological work in the 70s with a colleague in the United States, Walter Kinch, writing papers on discourse production and discourse processing and comprehension.
Mm-hmm.
So that brought in a cognitive dimension, which was for me very important.
Yeah.
But let's say the discourse structural analysis and the cognitive structural analysis in terms of mental models and so on was not enough to explain and to describe the kinds of discourses which are relevant in the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Now, another aspect, after coming back from Mexico to Holland in around 1980, I was also impressed by the fact that ethnic inequality like racism and racist discrimination in Holland was not being studied also by linguists. There were some people in sociology, but not really in linguistics.
Yeah.
So my main motivation to start more critical work was also to include a third dimension in my work. Not only discourse structures, and not only cognitive structures, but also social structures like racism.
Mm-hmm.
So my first studies in the 1980s were, for example, a little book in Dutch about racism in the mass media. Mm-hmm. And then I had a project, an official project in the Netherlands about racism in everyday talk, in conversations.
Mm-hmm.
So we went to interview people in Amsterdam, and then later I also went to the United States in California, and we interviewed people in different neighborhoods about immigrants, minorities, and so on. So that is how my work started on racism in the beginning of the 1980s. Most of my books, so most of them are also published in the 1980s, but for all this work, not only by me, but also by other people like Ruth Wodak and Norman Fairclough, they all had, Ruth Wodak was interested also in anti-Semitism, and Norman Fairclough in the United States in political of the left and the right, and so on, so all kinds of things. So more and more we sort of began to think about how can you sort of together found an approach which we called critical discourse studies, as an universal project of doing discourse studies. And there was one example already at the end of the 1970s by Roger Fowler and other people producing a book on language as control. And that was for us an example of the end of, they still were limited to more grammatical analysis, like questions of actives and passives and so on in sentences, but not really discourse analysis.
Yes.
But it was already, they called it critical linguistics, but we were more and more doing discourse analysis in several people in several countries.
Yeah.
So with the example of critical linguistics in England and Australia, we sort of began to do a more critical approach on the basis of discourse studies. Different people, different countries, so we had meetings, and we actually had the first meeting in Amsterdam in the beginning of the 1990s, where all these people got together. Yeah. And later this became, nearly each year we met in different places in Europe, and the group was also growing, different people, also students of ours and students of Norman Fairclough, like Lili Chuliaraki and also. There were many other people joining, also people from Spain, people from Portugal, people from Greece, and so on. So the group was growing, and there were more and more people. And then, of course, we also founded the journal Discourse in Society, and then it was more like international. So that is sort of how everything began.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the very detailed response. In CDA, we see that most researchers and scholars in the field of critical discourse studies, they consider CDA as a theory and a method. But I think that's not the case, because sometimes people, scholars like you, they take it as a perspective. Even in my own research, I have been using it as a perspective which draws on different theories, critical theories or official theories. So how do you elaborate this?
No, so today I prefer not to talk about CDA, but about CDS as critical discourse studies, emphasizing that it is not a method of analysis. Right. Many people still treat it that way, say, I'm going to apply the method of critical discourse analysis and so on. Of course, there is not one method of critical discourse analysis. There are many methods, quantitative, qualitative, and with the qualitative, so we can have narrative analysis, argumentation analysis, rhetorical analysis, style analysis, semantic analysis. There are many ways of doing it, and even within each field, within narrative analysis, there are 5-6 different kinds of doing narrative analysis. And if you do grammatical analysis, you can do more this kind of grammatical analysis or another. If you do argumentation analysis, again, there are different methods or different schools and approaches in the world. So it's not your method, it's just a panoply, an enormous collection of possible methods, sometimes also combined. Yeah, there's not just one. So people in a dissertation or a book or even an article say, I'm going to aspect this quantitative aspect of corpus analysis combined with this kind of semantic analysis. And so the general notion of critical discourse study is more a general perspective or a field, to study. Let's say a critical perspective with different kinds of methods. That's the idea.
Yeah, thank you very much. And your own approach to critical discourse studies is based on triangulation of discourse, cognition, and society.
Yes.
And we know discourse as a social practice or in terms of language use. So how do you explain this discourse in terms of cognition?
the main idea of critical discourse studies is to do a critical analysis through discourse of social issues like racism, sexism, oppression, marginalization, exclusion, and so on and so on.
Yeah.
So that's the idea. The only problem theoretically is that discourse structures are very different from social structures. So you cannot simply project social structures of discourse. There must be some kind of interface. And theoretically, this interface is here. It is in the minds of people. So people can see, understand, plan social structures like in actions and interactions, or social structures like inequality and poverty and so on. And they, in their interpretation of these social structures, they can also relate that with the cognitive structure of discourse. So discourse is planned and understood in terms of structures of the mind, different kind of like knowledge and so on and so on.
Yeah.
And the same thing is with society. So if you want to relate, for example, critical discourse studies as structures at all levels, from grammar to whatever, with discourse structure, with social structures, you need a mental interface, a cognitive interface. And there are many of them. That's one reason. So for critical discourse studies, needs necessarily a cognitive interface. Otherwise, the things don't come. It's just arbitrary to relate discourse structure to social structures. The only way this can be theoretically and empirically be related is through some kind of mental representation. That's the only way. Because otherwise it's just correlation. This kind of structure is correlation in text and correlation in society, but that's not causation. That's not the real relation. So that was that's one reason. And another reason is more analytical and theoretical, that many structures of discourse itself can only be described also in terms of cognition. For example, many of the structures of discourse have to do with knowledge. Even the grammar has to do with old knowledge and new knowledge, topic and comment, and so on. There are many structures, definite and indefinite articles, modalities. There are many structures of discourse for which you need to use notions which are cognitive notions and not linguistic notions, like knowledge and so on. So you need, even for discourse analysis itself, you need many cognitive notions. And for example, to explain many aspects of discourse, for example, coherence, you can simply say, well, as they said in the beginning, there's a semantic relationship between one notion and another notion, like, for example, notions of cohesion and systemic linguistics. But that's not what discourse and coherence is all about. He found out, through the cognitive work I did with Walter Kinch, that the real basis of coherence of a text is not in the text, but here. Coherence of a text is because people go through mental models of a situation the discourse is all about. Or they have a mental model about something in reality, and so the coherence of a text is not in the text itself, because the text is very incomplete. It's like the top of an iceberg. All the semantic relationships of the text itself cannot be seen. It is something which people have in their minds. So when people are producing or interpreting text, it is because they think in terms of knowledge, mental models, and so on. So there are two main reasons why, for me, this cognitive approach is important. First, as an empirical interface between discourse and society, which is necessary because they're not related. And second, because of the very description and analysis of discourse, you need many cognitive notions for which grammar or linguistics simply doesn't have any notions. So it is necessary for at least two reasons.
Yeah, and I think this is one important factor that makes your perspective different from other models in the CDS.
Yes.
Yeah, the factor of the cognition. it is something that makes your framework different from what Fairclough proposes.
Yes, and many people who work in discourse, like for example systemic linguistics, they're actually anti-cognitivistic.
Yeah,
it's a form of empiricism, which also exists in discursive psychology, for example, in England and so on and so on. It's a form of empiricism which says only what you can see is real, which of course is nonsense.
Yeah. Yeah. And one common concern that has been raised in the scholarly literature and is still being debated is CDS is biased because it allows you to take a position and analyze the discourses with a particular social ideological commitments. It reminds me of that critical debate between Fairclough and Widdowson in 1986. Widdowson said that the CDA is one kind of interpretation rather analysis. So how do you respond to this CDA being biased?
It's an old debate, and it's first of all it's old, and I think it has been settled. Let me say first, all academic research is biased. All. If you say you don't take a position politically, it's also taking a political position. So if people are being slaughtered in Gaza, for example, you can say, I don't take a position. That's not taking a position is also taking a position. So that is by itself inconsistent. You cannot take none. You are always, as a scholar, you are a man and a woman, you are part of a rich country or a poor country, you are homosexual or straight, and so on and so on. So all these identities you already have, and these identities, if you like it or not, have an influence on your work. What you're interested in, what you study, the choice of programs, of methods, and so on, is there all the time. So if you look at data, certain kinds of things you see or you don't see. And if you are a woman being discriminated, you see more rapidly certain kinds of sexist discrimination in text than straight men will see, and so on and so on. It's just an empirical question. So what Widdowson was saying, first of all, he only limited most of his work to Fairclough. There's a whole world of people doing critical discourse studies, and not just about many, many kinds of topics. So Widdowson is inconsistent, very much limited, and also that's just one thing. Another thing is that people who do critical discourse study should do good and systematic and explicit discourse analysis. Critical discourse analysis doesn't mean you should not do critical systematic analysis, of course. And most of these critical studies by many people, Ruth Wodak, myself, and many others, they have been very detailed, very specific, and very systematic and explicit. So that's just a question of method. And we know and use all kinds of methods, from grammar to experiments or quantitative work and so on. There are many methods which are explicit, systematic, and so on. The problem only is that we choose the topics. That is something explicit, and it's intentional, and it has to do. Our bias is a political bias because we want to be political. We want to study the racism of this newspaper and so on, or the racism of this scholarly program, or this racism of scientific discourse, and so on. That is our active, like many feminist women mostly will study discourses which discriminate against women, and so on. That is but the methods we use and the theories we use are very sophisticated and mostly also multidisciplinary. Not just looking at, let's say, lexical frequencies and no more. Of course, that doesn't make sense. You have to know most of academic work which is critical is necessarily also multidisciplinary. They know more than just one thing. They already went from words to sentences, and then to whole discourses or whole discourse programs, and then also to cognitive stuff, social psychology stuff about in-groups and out-groups, and then questions also of sociology, anthropology, and so most of this work is also multidisciplinary. So I'm afraid that I don't agree with Professor Widow said, because it's simply not really very, and also not very interesting.
Yeah, and even from critical discourse perspective, the notion of objective knowledge, which is claimed in the positivist science, so it becomes like illusion.
Yes, yes. And also, you should understand this kind of critical not as linguistic criticism, but it is political criticism.
Yeah.
It is simply political criticism. It is because they don't like it when in linguistics departments or English departments, people also do politics. That's the problem.
Thank you very much. And how do you see critical discourse studies becoming it becomes like a scholarly cult? Like we see that some people doing critical discourse studies, they only associate themselves with the Foucault, and while others associate with Fairclough or Van Dijk. So how do you see this scholarly cult in critical discourse studies, and people don't feel flexible in moving?
There's just schools, and that, I have always been, and am still, schooled. I am very much present in Latin America, where I went also and also have school. So in Brazil, you have French schools and English schools, because because they do a PhD in France or in England, so they have different with the same limitations. So in the same way, I've been critical, and it's offered and published. My criticism of systemic linguistics in Australia of many people, although very good scholars are there doing discourse analysis, whom I admire, for multimodal analysis of Theo van Leeuwen and Jim Martin of many topics and so on.
Yeah.
Only that the theory, which comes from Michael Halliday of the 50s and the 60s about systemic grammar, is limited. Is limited basically to clause structure. Everything beyond that is simply, so many of the studies, even critical studies, done in that way, is limited to that particular kind of paradigm. It's, for me, it's not only anti-cognitivistic, but even linguistically speaking, it doesn't recognize many kinds of things which have been developed only 50, 60 years ago. Everything in pragmatics, cognition, and so on, and so on, and so on, is not there. So, and it is also, I would rather call it not a school, but a sect, because they only cite their own work and everything else is excluded. And I find it terrible. If you look at scholarly problems, you have to see what kind of approach is best to do this kind of thing. And sometimes it's more linguistic analysis, and sometimes it's more, that's limited, and maybe even only lexical analysis, like most of the quantitative studies, from content analysis, and as in the old days, or let's say corpus linguistics today. But other structures are studied in many other kind of things, and different. So it is silly to only look at this or that. But some people do things a little bit better than others. So, for example, if Norman Fairclough studies the politics in England and political discourse in England of the 80s and 90s and so on, New Labour and stuff, he knows about it very well. And of course you can and should learn from them.
Yeah.
Like Ruth Wodak has been studying many years anti-Semitism and all kinds of things. And today, in her new book about the politics of fear and many other publications, she's studying the extreme right in Europe and in the rest of the world. And you can learn from that work whether or not it's not at school. She just looks at the kind of research being done. And the research is such. It's not critical discourse study. It doesn't say you should not use any kind of method. It is many kinds of methods, and we learn from everyone. And we are interested more in the issues and the main problem, the main domains and types of problems. And we are not talking in terms of specific methods or specific theories. Because theories are being developed constantly. Also in different disciplines. You cannot limit to one discipline. So any approach which is like a school or even worse, a sect. And a sect in the sense that you have one guru, which is, a head of the sect, and he or she will define you only can cite this kind of thing, and you should not cite or use other kind of thing. Now, for me, that's completely unscientific.
Mhm.
It is against any basic criteria of fundamental and critical scholarship.
Yeah, and this is something very important because recently, for example, I submitted one article to one of the journals in critical studies, and I tried to diversify the feminist scholarship in CDAs by bringing a Muslim feminist perspective to understand the patriarchal values in relation to religion in the Muslim society like Pakistan. But when I submitted it to the journal, the editor was actually not happy with this kind of theorization or bringing this critical voice. And he actually rejected it while arguing that you are actually trying to divide the world into a Muslim and a non-Muslim world.
Yeah.
So I was thinking that we have this Eurocentric thinking, which is dominant throughout the world, and that also divides the world into us and them. So that was kind of the irony. So how do you respond? The journals are actually have maintained certain epistemic boundaries around certain theories and methods, and they don't allow the critical voices coming into the field.
Yeah. That is not just for Muslim, but it has been the case for Catholic, Protestant for centuries in all science.
Mm-hmm.
It is there all the time.
Yeah.
Now, and today, of course, when the situation, there's not, the same thing. You have this kind of, very often,
Yes.
You have this kind of thing also very often combined with nationalism. For example, in India, of course, you know better than me, you have all kinds of nationalist kinds of things which are Hindi nationalism and so on, which is anti-Muslim and so on. So you have many of these things, they go together. Okay. Now that's one thing. And the question, of course, is all these things can be studied in many perspectives. For example, to avoid this kind of thing, our journals, we never publish anything about religion at all. Never. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter which religion at all. So if there is a step, we say for that specialized journal. So if you want to do a study of the Bible, for example, or of the Quran or whatever, you have to go to a specialized journal to do that kind of thing, because we don't have this particular kind of thing. Like many other topics we can't do. So that's the only thing. But in principle, you can, of course, let me say, how do I formulate it in the best way? What you can have in critical Muslim studies, in the same way you have critical Christian studies. For example, my colleague in Singapore, whom you know, like Michelle Azar, who is famous in feminist discourse, she's Catholic and a very convinced Catholic. Mm-hmm. So she may have perspectives which combine critical Catholic thing and the same. If you think of the situation in Brazil, mm-hmm. where many where the history of anti-racism is also very often related to religion. For example, abolitionist movement in many countries, also in Brazil, was also related to Christian things. So I myself have no explicit idea about it, in the sense that my position is this, and I can summarize. I'm just now improvising, thinking, what would I do, and what I do as a discourse, as a journal editor. Mm-hmm. And so, as a journal editor, we never publish about religion at all. We say, you do that in journals which are relevant. But the position people take, the critical position can be inspired by many things. Yeah. So it can be inspired by Christian ideas of equality, sympathy, empathy, or it can be also inspired by Muslim ideas. And so that is no problem. You only have to show it. Yeah. Where it comes from, I don't care. Many of the people who do critical discourse studies have a Christian background, but critical discourse analysis is being done in the whole world, and many people have sometimes maybe a more Buddhist or a more Muslim or Christian, and even with Christianity, different kinds of Protestant or Catholic backgrounds and so on. So the motivation is such. And the notions you borrow from that religion, you only have to Yeah, just show how it shows in discourse. So in principle, in the same way as a feminist will see more sexist aspects in discourse, someone who is a Muslim will see more anti-Islam.
So yes, and so in a way, we can say that CBS should not be like more secular. It should take inspiration from other kind of epistemology, including
Exactly. I mean, it is in the same way as we are not limited to one sect and so on, academic speaking, the same thing. If people have other inspirations and notions come from specific religion, in principle, that's not a problem if you can communicate and if it shows it is something which is analytically useful.
Yeah.
I mean, it can be concepts coming from all kinds of ideas, religions, systems, and so on. I would not limit it itself. I'm not religious at all, but I was educated in a Protestant family, and I was until in university. I also was religious, but in university, I simply unlearned everything.
Yeah. Exactly, and even now, people have started like engaging in decolonial scholarship.
Exactly.
They are bringing multiple voices into the fields.
Yes, exactly.
Your work on racism is well known in academic circles globally since the 80s. So you have worked on various types of discourses, political, corporate, educational discourses, and media discourses to show how racism works through these discourses, especially the concept of elite discourses. So I read through your critique of sociology textbooks recommended for college and university students, where you talk about how these highly circulated textbooks of sociology for the university students, they represent race, ethnicity, and all that. I was curious to know, how about the textbooks of linguistics and critical discourse studies or other social sciences? How do they represent race?
You mean academic textbooks or school
Academic textbooks?
Academic textbooks. I have not studied those because I have done in Holland since the 1980s already, many years. I studied, part of my work on racism was also textbooks.
Yeah.
So I did study of school textbooks in Holland and showed how they ignored immigration or didn't know about immigration. We're talking about the 1980s. That's a long time ago.
Yeah.
And we even have a group of teachers and different kind of people engaged, and we criticized textbooks and we had ideas how you can improve it. We also produced a little book called Colorful Choice, which says how textbooks could be multicultural, anti-racist, and so on. So that was in the 80s and especially in the 1990s, all right? Then I came here 25 years ago in 1999. I have been in contact with people also here working on this area of racism in schools and so on. But my work on textbooks then there was not much work. I've been some work on textbooks, but very little on academic textbooks. So I have not a long list of things I've done some work, but I was interested more generally also in socio-cognitive studies of how knowledge is being formulated in textbooks with some other colleagues of here in Barcelona. But it is not something I've been working on for a long time, and not in very much detail. So I have some work on it. There's a little book in Dutch published and an article in one of my books. But it is, and afterwards also some other things, but more limited studies. My data were mostly media, newspapers and so on. There are several books like Elite Discourse and, like the racism in the press and many things, and also political discourse. But and textbooks, racism in textbook, that's all the work, and mostly in Holland.
Yeah. And if we think of textbooks from critical discourse perspective, how far do you think that the textbooks can be used as ideological instruments to shape the identities and perspectives of the students in the classrooms?
Well, one of the practical education aims of critical discourse is to teach students how to think and how to think critically and how to do critical analysis. And the notions are very general. It's about any form of abuse of power, domination at all levels in society, and how this also shows up in discourse. Who is being quoted, not quoted, who is being described or not, who is being written about positively or negatively, and so on and so on. So this whole ideological square, like emphasizing, our good things and their bad things, and so on and so on, is applied wherever, and you can show it in discourse very easily. So a critical discourse, analysis of discourse, with these notions, basic notions, you can show how this works. And if you have a textbook, you at all levels of the textbook, both in the choice of the topics, the materials, the kinds of questions, and so on, there are many ways you can teach this kind of critical thinking about the world in general, and especially also how this is represented in text of the textbook. I'm not talking about English and so on and so on, but in any kind of national, but also in sociology textbook, history textbooks, and so on. It's the same thing. I mean, you have to learn to think critically about all kinds of discrimination, exclusion, polarization, and so on, and show, and not only critically, but also how to learn empathy, how to learn solidarity. My last book is on social movement discourse, is of an solidarity movement, refugees welcome, and it's not a critical book about this movement, but a book of solidarity.
Yeah, thank you very much. And then recently, one of the criticisms on critical discourse studies is that the CDS has failed to address the social inequalities and injustices because of commitment to the discursive engagement for discursive justices, but it doesn't transform the material realities of the people as such.
I can you rephrase the question, because I'm sorry. It's also I have a little bit difficulty understanding your English because our differences of accent.
Yeah.
But can you repeat your question, please?
Yeah, like one of the criticisms on critical discourse studies is that the CDS has failed to address the problems of people, like inequality, the injustices globally, because critical discourse studies is like you're doing kind of a discursive work only, identifying discourses and all that. But when it comes to the real world situation, the CDS does not offer any kind of instruments.
Well, not maybe all people here. So if Norman Fairclough is working on political discourse in England, that is because limited to England. And if Ruth Warwick is working on anti-Semitism, mostly in Europe, but in the ideas and the methods yet are being used all over the world in many disciplines. That's one thing.
Yeah.
Secondly, outside of Europe, there are many critical discourse scholars. For example, I go very often to Brazil, where my wife is from, and I was giving classes I give classes in Latin America all the time. So most of my teaching is more in Latin America and Brazil than here in Europe. Much more.
Yeah.
So people in Brazil, for example, are studying indigenous racism against indigenous people. So there's work on neocolonialism and decolonizing literature and so on. It's very active, and many other countries in Africa, the same thing, and the same thing in Asia. So there are scholars all over the world doing critical analysis of local forms of racism, exclusion, power abuse, and so on, and so on, and so on. So I think precisely critical discourse studies have been international. It is not being done only here, and actually not very much in the United States, but much more in Europe. And we have been, many of our PhDs, they are mine, many of them are from Latin America. And they go and are teaching in their own countries and so on. So critical discourse studies, for example, one of them who did a PhD with me here and she is, for example, studying how black people in Colombia are being discriminated, and she does interview with black women and some local who are a minority in Colombia and so on. So there's many people doing this kind of thing, and I hope that precisely because critical discourse studies is not European. On the contrary, it wants to be critical of European, critical of colonialism, critical of racism, and so on and so on. And actually, I'm now writing a paper together with a colleague in Brasilia, analyzing the history of Portuguese colonial laws about Brazil.
Yeah.
And so it's basically a contribution to decolonial studies, also from a critical perspective. So we are doing that, and I'm just one, that's just me.
Yeah.
But there are many, many, many people in Brazil and Latin America, and I'm sure also in Pakistan, in India, and anywhere.
Yeah. So in a way, we can say that CDS is not just a lip service, but you are actually engaged in the intellectual and the political movement.
Oh yes, yes.
Yeah.
It's very active, and as I said, of course, anti-racism is automatically also international because it is critical of all people, criticizing people from the global south. People like Michel Azar actually did a special issue of Discourse in Society about the global south. We did that, and so on. So our work is, and also in Australia, New Zealand, and so on, but mostly also because discourse study is very popular in Latin America. Many people in Latin American conferences, in books, articles, and so on, public critical studies of local situations, local marginalization of minorities, and so on, and so on, and so on. Oh yes, it's very active and organized and published.
And how do you see these two categories now, Global South and Global North?
It's a very general kind of thing. I mean, any big kind of thing. Let me just comment very briefly on this. First of all, it is fuzzy because many people of the South are actually, they're not like yourself. And you are just a PhD student. There are all many very famous people from the South who work and have big positions in the North. Beatrice Spivak and many others as well. Okay.
Yeah.
I know these people and they do fantastic work, but they work in the North. Okay. And many people who are in the South have had education like yourself in the North. So what is it? Is it the position of the South? Or is it someone educated in the North, ideas and notions from the North and so on? So the question of North and South, academically speaking, economically speaking, and question of poverty is obvious. Of course, here are also poor people, and in the South also rich people, and so on. So it's, even that is not very, but let's limit it only not to academics. An academic, the thing North and South is so mixed. Many of the students of the South come to the North and then go back to the South and do their thing locally. And many people of the South come and teach and study in the North and so on. And many people like me of the North go to the South. And most of my lectures, I've been lectured in all countries of Latin America. All of them. And in the Caribbean and so on. And I've been giving lectures in Southeast Asia, in Thailand. In January, I'm going to Vietnam and to Thailand, and I'm giving a talk also in Bangkok and so on. And I've been giving talks in the Philippines, in Vietnam, in Malaysia, in Indonesia. So I've been working with people and giving lectures in the South. So I live here, and I now work here. I also worked and lived in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil with my wife. So am I now a scholar of the North? I am born here and I work here, but most of my work and interest and contacts are in Latin America. So what am I? And the same thing. So, and I'm not the only one. So many people of the North have been working in the South with colleagues of the South, have students in the South, and so on. So the global North and South is true for questions of power. Access, the fact that you have to come here to do your PhD and cannot do it in Pakistan or in Delhi and so on. That gives already, that makes the question of access the money, resources, and so that's obvious. And more inequality and poverty in the South, in the global South, but not everywhere. But if you go to Singapore, the situation is very different from other places in the South. So it depends where you go in the South. And the same thing in the where you go in the North, it depends, because they're very, maybe in the United States and so on, that's it. All right.
Yeah, exactly. One last question. For example, if I look at the course outline in Pakistan about teaching of critical discourse studies to students of universities, like they're mostly from like Anglo-Western school of thought, right? We don't find other people.
Which one are they?
We see Norman Fickler's three models are Van Dijk and Dog. But even I would say that Norman Fickler is more popular in the context of Pakistan.
Of course, because he published it is in English and he published in England and so on, and the kinds of things were popular.
Yeah, exactly. So I was thinking like how to rethink this outline in order to bring the diverse voices and.
What can I say? I can regret it that it's not more general. One, I can regret that it's not people from there, and select people in the South to be inspired. Why not read and apply the work of Michel Azar, who's from India, in Singapore, and so on. Excellent people, use them.
Yeah.
And it's a pity. And I think that if you want to do feminist critical discourse studies, you can not use the work of Michel Azar and so on. So there are many examples of people who have been doing critical discourse studies in many countries, also in the North and in the South, which can be applied. And that people focus on one person, that's regrettable. So when, for example, people also in Arabic countries, I'm going to apply your model. You say, but please don't do that, because I don't have a model to show and so on. For you have to adapt the theories and the methods to the kind of object and problems you have. It's not one person who does this kind of thing. But in fact, it's like with music, it's with fashion. Some kind of things are fashionable, and other kinds are not so fashionable. One cannot do anything about it. It's just because programs, students have limited time, limited perspectives and so on, and they tend to focus it. So people typically in some places they only use me, and they say, no, there's also this and this and this. So I'm against schools, against sects, and against this particular kind of one person theory. Like, for example, it happens all the time. The people say, I'm doing my PhD thesis and I'm going to use my work. I said, please, what are you talking about? Your bibliography should be international, and you should choose the kind of studies which are relevant for your work. So if I haven't done work on that particular topic, you should not send me at all. You should find relevant, so the notion is relevance. So if you don't choose the best scholarship around in the world, it is already limited to language. But most people will only have international access to English and not to German, French, and so on. So that's or Spanish, actually. So many of the journals we did, we could not publish international, and they're not being cited because they're things in Spanish, which is, of course, very, very serious limitation. So I regret all these kind of limitations, but unfortunately, people are not perfect, and scholarly programs and textbooks are not perfect, and they will limit just well. And I can control it a bit through the journals, because I can say, okay, I want diverse journals. So if there's an article coming from Pakistan, I don't get this every day. Let's give it special interest. Happens all the time. That's the way I can only do it. But that's a limited power I have. It is power, but it's only limited.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Teun. It was wonderful talking to you, and such a great honor to talk to you.
No, it's a pleasure. And should later you have more questions, I can also reply written. So you think, oh, I forgot to ask this.
Mm-hmm.
You ask me and I will speak, or we do it online by Zoom, or I will just write it. Okay?
Thank you so much.